before oh, just wait a minute, there's still people. The doors are closed now. Okay. Before I start, I would like you to control if you switched off your cell phones. This morning in the museum there was some disturbance. Okay, thank you very much. Mrs. Dean, Dr. Cuno, ladies and gentlemen. Before introducing our distinguished speaker, I would on behalf of our foundation like to commemorate the passing away of Mrs. Gerson on the 1st of June of this year in this respectable age of 107. She has attended Gerson lectures as long as she was able to, and she always enormously enjoyed them. Mrs. Gerson was of course foremost in making us remember Horst Gerson's life and accomplishments. When she was telling us about him, and that was quite often, her eyes started to twinkle, and it was as if for a moment her husband had returned to life. But Mrs. Gerson was far more than was just Horst Gerson's wife. She was an exceptionally strong, independent, informed, original and optimistic woman. Mrs. Gerson has meant very much to many people in many circumstances. We shall always fondly remember her. And we are very glad that Flip and Suzanne and Hans and Jackie are here with us today, as they have been at all the Gerson lectures, and as we hope they will be at the Gerson lectures to come. Those Gerson lectures to come will not be supervised as great words by me, but by Anne-Sophie Lehmann, who is sitting there in the corner. She will succeed me because I am already retired for a week. And, so I wish Anne-Sophie lots of success to succeed me in this very honourable position. Then I will introduce to you Dr. Cuno. James Cuno's career is outstanding. After having been rewarded his doctoral degree in art history at Harvard University, he fulfilled various important professorships and directorships of museums. In 1991, Dr. Cuno became director of the Harvard University Art Museums and professor at that same university until 2003. In 2003 to 2004, he served as the director of the Cuno Institute, London. And from 2004 till 2011, he presided over the Art Institute of Chicago. He also headed the Association of American Museum Directors. And in 2011, Dr. Cuno became CEO of the Getty Foundation of Los Angeles, which position he still holds today. We invited Dr. Cuno because he is one of the most influential spokesmen on the issue of the world's cultural heritage. He is the staunchest defender of the idea that museums and other art institutions are seminal in the worldwide safeguarding, conservation, studying and display of this heritage for the benefit of mankind. Amongst Dr. Cuno's articles and books, there are three collections of essays by himself and some of his kindred spirits. The first has as its titles, Whose Muse? The second, Whose Culture? The third, Who Owns Antiquity? The essential question behind these questions is one of ownership. In the view of Dr. Cuno and his fellow authors, the great encyclopedic museums of our times serve, so to say, as a counterforce against all those persons and institutions that nowadays are claiming exclusive ownership of what is in effect the world's common cultural heritage. More than against anything else, Dr. Cuno's mission is directed against the modern state, nation state, and its, in his eyes, false pretenses of ownership. According to Dr. Cuno, objects of cultural heritage should not be owned by anybody, but shared by everyone. Cultural heritage is about transnational cultural understanding. Dr. Cuno's mission has become very urgent indeed, now that ISIS has started to knock down what is considered to be the world's cultural heritage par excellence. Dr. Cuno, we are very honored that you accepted our invitation to deliver the 18th Horst-Gerson lecture, and we are very glad to have you here with us today. May I now invite you to take my place and deliver the 18th Horst-Gerson lecture.
Thank you very much. That was very, very kind and entirely too generous. So thank you. It's a great honor to be here. It's a great honor to be in your company and to be in this grand room and to be offered the opportunity to remember the great contributions of Horst Gerson. And I gathered from your introduction, his children are here. I assume that's who they were. Where are they? Oh, there. Well, it's a great pleasure. And here as well? No? And here as well. It's a great pleasure to be in your company and to remember your father by this lecture, but also, of course, to remember your mother. What an extraordinary life. We should all be so blessed to be in the company of someone who has lived so long. So I want to talk about this today on this very humbling occasion for me, about something that is of great import, I think, today. I hope I can do it justice. And that is about the threat that ISIS represents to our cultural heritage. I will offer a 5-point proposal about how one might respond to it. There could be any number of other such proposals, I understand that, but I will do my best to make sense of these 5 for you. Yeah, okay. So word came early last month that ISIS destroyed a 1st century Roman-era temple in Palmyra, Syria, consecrated to the Mesopotamian god Bel. You can see this on the screen. You can see it before and after to see what the destruction was like. This is from satellite images. 2 weeks earlier, we had learned that ISIS had beheaded and put on public display the mutilated corpse of Khaled al-Assad, the archaeologist in charge of antiquities in Palmyra. And 6 months before that, we saw a video showing followers of ISIS destroying ancient Assyrian sculptures in the museum in Mosul, Iraq. Why did ISIS destroy these antiquities and behead the man who cared for them? Because they are afraid of worldviews other than their own. It is as simple as that. As the contemporary historian, you'll know him well, Simon Sharma, has written, ISIS acts from an instinct of cultural panic that the supreme works of the past will lead people astray from blind, absolute obedience. ISIS is afraid of ideas. It demands absolute obedience. And it kills people and destroys the things it fears. Its worldview is monotheistic, and its enemy is polytheism, cosmopolitanism, and modernity. Over the course of this lecture, I will consider ISIS's campaign against the region's cultural heritage, and will try to explore the conceptual framework and limitations of the United Nations response to it. A word of caution, my conclusions must be tentative. Developments in the region are changing rapidly, as we know every day when we read the paper, and what we conclude today will likely have to be rethought tomorrow. First, what is ISIS? A terrorist group, a pseudo-state, or an anti-state caliphate? ISIS originated in 1999 as a Sunni insurgency force allied with the Jordanian radical leader Abu Musab al-Zarqawi under the group name the Organization of Monotheism and Jihad. In October 2004, Zarqawi swore a loyalty to Osama bin Laden and changed the group's name to the Organization of Jihad's Base in Mesopotamia, commonly called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI. Then in January 2006, AQI joined with others to form the Mujahideen Shura Council, which 9 months later changed its name to the Islamic State in Iraq. With the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011, the Islamic State expanded into Syria and changed its name to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. And in 2014, ISIS declared itself a caliphate, with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi its leader, or caliph. Baghdadi was born Ibrahim bin Awad bin Ibrahim al-Badri al-Qarash in the Iraqi city of Samarra, once the seat of the ruling Abbasid caliphs. The Babardi tribe to which he belongs includes within its lineage the Prophet Muhammad's tribe of Qurashi. In the classical Sunni tradition, the caliph is required to be a Qurashite. Forgive my pronunciation. By assuming the name Abu Bakr, Baghdadi is aligning himself with the first caliph and son-in-law of the prophet of the same name, who launched attacks against the Sassanid and Byzantine empires, setting in motion the historical trajectory that led to the formation of one of the largest empires in history. This is Baghdadi's ambition, and he has been astonishingly successful in pursuit of it. Within a little more than a year, the self-proclaimed caliphate has become the most powerful and effective jihadist group in the world. Controlling an area larger than Great Britain and inhabited by some 6 million people, with 11 affiliates from Nigeria and Algeria in the west to Pakistan and Russia in the east. But to call ISIS simply a jihadist group, which for many in the West means a terrorist group, is a mistake. Audrey Kurth Cronin, a professor and specialist in international security at Washington's George Mason University, has argued that, to quote her, although ISIS uses terrorism as a tactic, it is not really a terrorist organization at all. Terrorist networks, such as Al-Qaeda, generally have only dozens or hundreds of members, attack civilians, do not hold territory, and cannot directly confront military forces. ISIS, on the other hand, boasts some 30,000 fighters, holds territory in both Iraq and Syria, maintains extensive military capabilities, controls lines of communication, commands infrastructure, funds itself, and engages in sophisticated military operations. If ISIS is purely and simply anything, she wrote, it is a pseudo-state led by a conventional army with a sophisticated finance model comprising a wide-ranging extortion racket that targets owners and producers in ISIS territory, taxing everything from small family farms to large enterprises, such as cell phone service providers, water delivery companies, and electric utilities. The enterprise, Cronin continued, is so complex that the US Treasury has declined to estimate ISIS's total assets and revenues, but ISIS is clearly a highly diversified enterprise whose wealth dwarfs that of any terrorist organization. Abdel Bari Atwan, editor-in-chief of Rai Al-Yum, the Arab world's first digital news and opinion website, and former editor-in-chief of the London-based pan-Arab newspaper Al-Quds Arabi, goes even further. In his recent book, Islamic State, the Digital Caliphate, he describes ISIS's sophisticated governance structure as, in his words, a highly centralized and disciplined organization with a sophisticated security apparatus and capacity for delegating power. Baghdadi and his advisors, he goes on, set ISIS's overall objectives, which are then passed down the chain of command through commanders and administrators. Included in Baghdadi's cabinet are the leaders of the Sharia Council, which enforces religious obedience, the Education Council, which oversees a curriculum adopted in its entirety from ultra-Orthodox Saudi schools, and the Economic Council, which manages ISIS's budget with revenues deriving from taxes, bank robberies, kidnap ransoms, and black market economic transactions in the sale of oil, some of it sold directly to the Assad regime in Syria, and looted cultural property. In January 2015, the Economic Council's annual report listed overall receipts close to $2 billion, with a surplus of $250 million. But however much ISIS looks and functions like a state, not to mention that it calls itself, of course, the Islamic State. It is more than that. It is a self-proclaimed caliphate, an anti-state, a form of political control that respects no borders, but is a region without borders, where, as ISIS leaders have proclaimed, the Arab and non-Arab, the white man and the black man, the Easterner and Westerner are all brothers. Syria is not for Syrians, and Iraq is not for Iraqis, they proclaimed. They are both part of a borderless caliphate of ideology and enforced obedience, which harkens back to a time before the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the formation of the modern nation-states of Iraq and Syria under British and French mandates. When Baghdadi declared the restored caliphate, he vowed to erase the name of, in his words, the Sykes-Picot conspiracy and promised to destroy the old borders of Iraq and Syria. And last year, his fighters did just that, if only symbolically. They blew up customs checkpoints between the two countries. In the world of ISIS, there are no borders within the caliphate. Rather, it crosses borders, which it sees as false political divisions imposed on a theocratic reality by European powers. And in a way, of course, they are not all wrong. Nation-states, as a form of political order, derived only from the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. That peace, actually a series of peace treaties, reordered Europe into states with sovereignty over a specific geographic area, a defined territory, single government, and permanent population recognized and respected by other nations. 300 years later, such an order became the basis of the United Nations, the international body to which the international community typically turns to resolve matters of international dispute, such as what to do about ISIS and its disregard for the territorial and political sovereignty of Iraq and Syria. The Charter of the United Nations is the organization's founding treaty. It makes clear the UN's basis on the recognition of nation-state sovereignty. For example, Article 2, Section 1 reads in part, "The organization of the UN is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of its members. And Article 2, Section 4 says, "All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations." UN member states wouldn't join the organization if their sovereignty weren't recognized. And the UN is a volunteer organization. No member state is compelled to join it, and nothing of consequence can happen without the approval of the UN's General Assembly, which comprises representatives from all member states, whose membership, defined by the UN, is based on national sovereignty, sovereign equality. This is not always the most effective or efficient way to organize international responses to challenging situations, as we've seen with regard to ISIS. The historian of the United Nations, Paul Kennedy of Yale University, has described the UN like this. He says, "The United Nations could never escape the central paradox of all international bodies. The paradox is this: since the World Organization was created by its member states, which acted like shareholders in a corporation, it can function effectively only when it received the support of national governments, especially those of the larger powers. Nations can ignore the world body, and the organization cannot pursue proposed actions if a great power, that is, if one of the 5 countries possessing the veto power, is opposed. This tension between the sovereignty and internationalism is inherent, persistent, and unavoidable in the UN." So how does the UN respond to aggressiveness of non-state actors like ISIS, which is not a nation-state? It does so in 2 ways. First, by issuing Security Council or General Assembly resolutions, and by seeking broad coalition-based political and military actions. The Security Council comprises 15 members and is charged with maintaining the UN's response to international peace and security in the world. 5 of its members, the victors of World War II, the US, Russia, France, Great Britain, and China, have permanent council status and veto power. Nothing of consequence happens at the UN without Security Council approval. And currently its Big Five members don't all agree in what to do about ISIS. We're seeing that played out today, yesterday, day before yesterday, with Russia's activities in the region. Nevertheless, the Security Council issues resolutions condemning various actions by ISIS, and these must serve as the basis of any UN action in the region. To this end, and to date, the UN Security Council has adopted 8 resolutions affirming the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria and Iraq, and condemning ISIS and its destruction of cultural heritage. Then on May 28, 2015, the General Assembly unanimously adopted a resolution condemning ISIS's destruction of cultural heritage in Iraq and Syria. The language of these resolutions is important. UN Security Council Resolution 2165, for example, reaffirmed the UN's strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria. Then 1 month later, UN Security Council Resolution 2170 did the same for Iraq. And further, it condemned the destruction of cultural and religious sites within Iraq's borders. 4 months later, in December 2014, UN Security Council Resolution 2195 expressed concern that, quote, terrorists benefit from transnational organized crime in some regions, including from the trafficking of arms, persons, drugs, and artifacts, and from the illicit trade in natural resources, including gold and other precious metals and stones, and that terrorist groups benefiting from transnational organized crime may contribute to undermining affected states, specifically their security, stability, governance, social, and economic development. Finally, after 8 such UN Security Council resolutions, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 2199 on May 28, 2015, that's the most recent resolution, unanimously calling for, quote, an immediate halt to the wanton destruction of the cultural heritage of Iraq, including religious sites or objects, emphasizing that no such acts committed by ISIL or other individuals, groups, undertakings, and entities associated with Al-Qaeda will be tolerated, urging the preservation of the cultural heritage of Iraq by protecting cultural and religious properties and sites consistent with international humanitarian law, and by stressing that the perpetrators of attacks intentionally directed against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, or charitable purposes, or historic monuments will be held accountable. To date, over 17 months, this is the UN's response to ISIS's terrorist attacks on individuals and categories of people and cultural heritage sites, monuments, and artifacts, which ISIS holds as contrary to the teachings of the Prophet and the role of Islam in the world. 8 resolutions that, 1, respect the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the nation-state. 2, condemn ISIS for its destruction of Iraqi and Syrian cultural heritage. 3, prohibit the use of funds to directly or indirectly benefit ISIS. 4, hold all parties accountable to the relevant provisions of international law. 5, demand that all UN member states take appropriate steps to prevent trade in Iraqi and Syrian cultural heritage. 6, call on UNESCO and Interpol to assist in this effort. And 7, counter extremism and intolerance within the countries through education and the strengthening of civil society. And still, ISIS grows larger and commands more territory and wreaks more havoc in the region. It is within this period of time that ISIS blew up the Temple of Bel, decapitated Khalid al-Assad, and destroyed the sculptures in the Museum of Mosul, all in contravention of the UN resolutions that comprise the extent of UN's actions against ISIS. At the same time, and perhaps with an eye toward future change in the region and around the world, which is not expected to prevent ISIS's actions, only perhaps to prevent future similar actions once ISIS has been defeated, UNESCO, the UN's soft power arm, has held meetings, convened conferences, and issued statements of its own. Director General Irina Bokova, seen here on the left and lower right, is an eloquent and impassioned spokeswoman for UNESCO, the ideals of which are inscribed in its constitution. And I quote, "The purpose of the organization, UNESCO, is to contribute to peace and security by promoting collaboration among the nations through education, science, and culture in order to further universal respect for justice, for the rule of law, and for the human rights and fundamental freedoms which are affirmed for the peoples of the world without distinctions of race, sex, language, or religion by the Charter of the United Nations. And with the outbreak of the fighting in Iraq and Syria, and especially with the emergence of ISIS in 2014, these ideals have been put to the test. On June 17, 2014, UNESCO Director Bokova called on all Iraqis to stand united for the protection of their country's cultural heritage, which she also declared to be a unique testimony, a testimony of humanity and to the origins of our civilization and of our inter-ethnic and inter-religious existence. It is also key, she said, to the resilience for building a better future in the region. Then on September 22nd, 2014, at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, she called the destruction of cultural heritage cultural cleansing, cultural eradication, and cultural looting. And she emphasized that protecting heritage must be an integral part of all peace building, that saving the past of Iraq and Syria is essential to saving our collective future. And to build peace tomorrow, we need to safeguard today their, Iraq and Syria's, heritage of diversity and tolerance to prepare the ground for reconciliation, and that the destruction of cultural heritage is a crime against humanity. 6 months later, on March 7, 2015, she called the deliberate destruction of heritage a war crime, equivalent to the acts of cultural cleansing. Murder and destruction of culture, she declared, are linked. Then on April 2nd, 2015, she called on all Syrians to unite for the protection of their shared cultural heritage. This heritage belongs to all Syrians and to all humanity, she said. I call on all parties to refrain from using cultural heritage sites for military purposes and to protect them against any possible destruction resulting from fighting. And 11 days later, she stated without qualification that the deliberate destruction of heritage is a war crime. And she appealed to the world to support Iraqi youth and to mobilize young people around the world to protect cultural heritage. She said, we must respond by showing that exchange and dialogue between cultures is the driving force for all. We must respond by showing that diversity has always been and remains today a strength for all societies. We must respond by standing up against forces of fragmentation, by refusing to be divided into us and them. We must respond by claiming our cultural heritage as the commonwealth of all humanity. These are complicated ideas. To whom does the cultural heritage in Iraq and Syria belong? To the nation state or to humanity? If the former, is there a difference between claims of identity made on cultural heritage produced during historical eras, the eras of Sumer, Babylonia, Assyria, the Achaemenid Empire, the Seleucids, Parthians, and Sasanians? The difference between those and that which has been produced by living cultures, Sunni, Shia, and Alawites, Islam, Protestant, Roman, and Orthodox Christianity, and stateless ethnic groups such as the Kurds. What does it mean to claim a national culture for Iraq and Syria when the very concept of the nation state in those countries is under so much stress? Is national identity even the right measure of identity at all when talking about the Middle East? Bokova's statements do not address these questions, and UNESCO's policies and conventions cling fast to the European ideal of a coherent nation-state, coincident in territory with a singular ethnic or historical culture. Take UNESCO's Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property of 1970. It holds that cultural property or cultural heritage, the terms are synonymous. According to the state-based ideology of the UN, cultural heritage is by nature state property. It holds it to be one of the basic elements of civilization and national culture, although it gives responsibility for safeguarding the cultural elements of civilization to individual nation states. It says that it is incumbent upon every state to protect the cultural property existing within its territory against the dangers of theft, clandestine excavation, and illicit exports. And the protection of cultural heritage can be effective only if organized both nationally and internationally among states working in close cooperation. We should note that Iraq and Syria are both member state signatories to that convention. A second UNESCO convention concerning the protection of the world's cultural heritage, natural heritage, 1972, similarly gives nation states, including Iraq and Syria, both of which are signatories to this now second convention, quote, the duty of ensuring the identification, protection, conservation, presentation, and transmission to future generations of the cultural and natural heritage referred to in Articles 1 and 2, and situated on its territory, belongs primarily to the state. How can Iraq and Syria protect the cultural heritage within their national borders when the extent of their borders does not correspond with the areas over which they have effective control? On December 3rd, 2014, UNESCO held an international conference on heritage and cultural diversity at risk in Iraq and Syria, and it called for the implementation of an earlier cultural heritage convention, the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, which would seem to describe the current conditions prevailing in Iraq and Syria. Among other things, Hague 1954 obligates its nation-state signatories to 1. Prevent the exportation of cultural property from a territory occupied by them during an armed conflict. 2. Take into its custody cultural property imported into its territory, either directly or indirectly from any occupied territory. 3. Return such cultural property at the close of hostilities to the competent authorities of the territory previously occupied. And 4. Pay an indemnity to the holders in good faith of any cultural property which has to be returned in accordance with the previous statements. Like the UN and UNESCO, Hague 1954 was conceived in the aftermath of World War II. It is not clear how it applies in the case of Iraq and Syria, with so many non-state parties active and controlling substantial areas within national borders there. The same is true of the second protocol to the convention signed in 1999. It calls upon state parties to the convention, i.e. the nation-states who have signed it. Syria has signed it, Iraq has not, to take measures in times of peace for safeguarding cultural property. It allows waivers on the basis of imperative military necessity when, quote, no choice is possible between such use of the cultural property and another feasible method for obtaining a similar military advantage. We should note that the decision to invoke military necessity can be made only by, quote, an officer commanding a force equivalent of a battalion in size or larger, or a force smaller in size where circumstances do not permit otherwise. Article 6 says distinctions distinctions hardly relevant in the fight against ISIS, and it forbids any illicit export, other removal, or transfer of ownership of cultural property. It also defines the terms for placing cultural property under enhanced protection. Number 1, because its cultural heritage is of the greatest importance to humanity, it says. Number 2, because it's protected by adequate domestic, legal, and administrative measures, recognizing its exceptional cultural and historic value and ensuring the highest level of protection. Number 3, and it's not used for military purposes or to shield military sites, and a declaration has been made by the party which has control over the cultural property, confirming that it will not be so used. To receive such enhanced protection, the party that has jurisdiction or control over the property must request it by submitting to the committee a list of cultural properties for which it intends to request the granting of enhanced protection, but then other parties, such as the International Committee of the Blue Shield and other non-governmental organizations with relevant expertise, may recommend specific cultural property to the committee for enhanced protection too. Now, however well-intentioned Hague 1954 was and is, given the chaos and existential threats Iraq and Syria currently face, it is difficult to imagine either state government filling out the forms and making the case for enhanced protection of the many cultural heritage sites and monuments within its jurisdiction. It is equally difficult to imagine ISIS intimidated or rebuffed by such enhanced protection if it were provided to Iraq and Syria. The UN, UNESCO, and the international community have focused attention on the illicit trade in portable cultural heritage artifacts from Iraq and Syria. I show you here a slide of hundreds of illegal excavations of the region. It's really dramatic. On March 6, 2015, UNESCO Director General Bokova sent letters to directors of museums and cultural institutions around the world, calling their attention to the UN Security Council Resolution 2199, which he said extending to Syria the prohibition of trade of cultural objects already in place for Iraq since 2003. And then she invited their cooperation, these cultural institutions' cooperation, by verifying systematically the provenance and title of cultural objects entering your art market or your collections, especially those of an archaeological nature. It notes, she goes on, with concern that the looting and trafficking of cultural objects is one of the sources of financing of the Islamic State in Iraq and in the Levant, ISIL, Al-Nusra Front, and other individuals, groups, and entities associated with Al-Qaeda. And it declares that such funding is being used to support recruitment efforts and to strengthen operational capability and carry out terrorist attacks. But what is the extent and value of this dark trade? There's no debate about the destruction of the archaeological record that's represented by the slides that you see on the screen right now. The question is, what is the extent and value of the trade in such things that are uncovered through the illicit excavations that we see evidence of on the screen? Determining this is important, as it is a pillar, and in fact it is to date the only such UN response to the destruction of cultural heritage within the region. It has also garnered a lot of press attention, giving the false impression that this is the gravest threat to cultural heritage artifacts in the region. The accuracy of the reports about the level and value of this activity is difficult to determine, but it all seems to have begun with a June 15, 2014 article in the Guardian newspaper, which reported that an ISIS courier named Abu Hajar had been captured and interrogated, and that in the process, Iraqi intelligence agents had recovered 160 computer flash drives with information about ISIS and how it operates, including, quote, full accounts of the group's finances. In the same article, it was said that ISIS was known to have reaped windfalls from smuggling all manner of raw materials pillaged from the crumbling state, as well as priceless antiquities from archaeological digs. And the article's author, Martin Chuloff, citing a foreign intelligence official, said that they have taken $36 million from Al-Nabek alone, which is an area in the mountains west of Damascus. That day, after this article was published in the Guardian newspaper, various bloggers and websites repeated the news, a few in some detail. On conflictantiquities.wordpress.com, Samuel Hardy wrote that there is now secure, if imprecise, evidence that, like other parties in the Syrian civil war, the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, the Levant, ISIS, is using the looting and trafficking of antiquities to fund its fighting. But he wondered about the accuracy of the $36 million figure, explaining that, quote, normally looters earn less than 1% or 2%, and a chain of middlemen take more than 99% of the final sale price of such objects. So either ISIL alone are shifting unimaginable quantities of material, antiquities with a market value of up to $1.44 billion to $3.6 billion, or at least $81 million to $800 million from Al-Nabek alone, or they are late middlemen, and the $36 million is a larger proportion of the final sale price, or more mundane criminal activities from a larger proportion of the paramilitary group's income. Hard to figure out all this math and all this sort of stuff, but some give you the impression that it is precise by giving you numbers that sound precise. 2 days later, Kathleen Calderwood, a reporter for the International Business Times, which is a digital global news publication, repeated Chuloff's claim of $36 million from this one site alone, and quoted Hardy about the secure, imprecise evidence that ISIS is using the looting and trafficking of antiquities to fund its fighting, and cited UNESCO as a source for estimates that global trade in conflict antiquities could be worth more than $2.2 billion, and growing criminal groups recognize the value in very, very old things. Then on September 2nd, 2014, Al Monitor reported looted artifacts passing through Turkey and cited the Guardian's account of ISIS getting $36 million from the sale of looted antiquities, and it repeated UNESCO's estimate that war antiquities amount to $2.2 billion of illicit market annually. And then it quoted Amir Al-Azam, an associate professor of anthropology and Middle Eastern history at Shawnee State University in Ohio, in the United States, who said, quote, my sources tell me that a lot of this stuff ends up crossing the Turkish border. Some international dealers, non-Turks, started to come into Syria, but it quickly got too dangerous for them. Now the dealers all hang out across the border in Turkey. Only Turkish dealers come into Syria to meet with locals. They buy it and take it back. One of the main centers of smuggling is Tel Abdad, on the Syrian side, across the border from Urfa. There's also lots of smuggling in Kilis, some of it archaeology. From there, I don't know where it goes. Not very precise accounting of the movement of illicit antiquities. But these remarks are typical of the media chatter about the illicit trade in portable antiquities from Iraq and Syria. And there is no doubt that catastrophic looting of archaeological sites and destruction of cultural monuments is occurring in Iraq and Syria. Just look again at this incredible image of illegal excavations. But what the financial value of such activity is, and to what extent it's being traded to whom and how important it is to the funding of ISIS, remains speculation and hearsay. And I'm concerned too much credibility is being given to that activity at the expense of other such activities, similar activities. Also, it is important to point out that these concerns about illicit excavations and the illegal trade in antiquities are only about portable objects. What about the non-portable built heritage, which is equally important to our understanding and appreciation of the cultural heritage in the region? Since 2004, 5 of the 6 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Syria, and again I show you the Temple of Bel, have been heavily damaged. So 4 of the 6 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Syria have been heavily damaged. 4 have been requisitioned for military purposes in direct violation of international protocols. Bombs have devastated Aleppo's old city. Medieval forts have been damaged, and Parthian and Hellenistic sites have been pillaged. In addition, 1,800 of Iraq's 12,000 registered archaeological sites, among them the ancient cities of Nineveh, Dur-Sharrukin, Ashur, Hatra, Nimrud, and Mosul, including the Mosul Museum, where the destruction of the ancient sculptures was videotaped, and the Mosul libraries, where looting as many as 2,000 non-Islamic books and burning hundreds of other books of science and culture have been damaged or looted. So despite this tragic tale of damage and destruction of the built heritage sites, let alone the exploitation of illegal excavations of portable objects, few political or cultural leaders have called for military intervention to protect such sites. As I write, the coalition of forces conducting airstrikes against ISIS in Syria have struck more than 7,650 targets, including vehicles, bunkers, fighting positions, and structures, but none has boots on the ground protecting the larger number of heritage sites in Iraq and Syria. What will it take for the UN to reinforce its rhetoric with military action? UN Blue Helmets comprise military forces contributed to UN operations by national armies. They remain first and foremost members of their own national armies and are only seconded to the work of the UN, in keeping with the state-based foundation of UN policy. They monitor disputed borders, observe peace processes in post-conflict areas, provide security across a conflict zone, assist in-country military personnel with training and support, assist ex-combatants in implementing peace agreements, and are deployed by the authority of the UN Security Council. If the Security Council approves deployment, it then adopts a resolution setting out the operation's mandate and size, and details a task for which the force will be responsible. The Secretary General then provides regular reports to the Security Council on the implementation of the mission's mandate, which the Security Council reviews and renews or adjusts as required until the mission is completed. No resolution supported the deployment of Blue Helmets in Iraq and Syria for the protection of cultural heritage has been approved, although such protection has been called for by the Italian Cultural Minister Dario Franceschini. Protecting the world's ancient heritage in Iraq and Syria will take a coordinated and multi-pronged approach. And to that end, and in conclusion, I offer a 5-point proposal for the protection of heritage in Iraq and Syria. Number 1, embrace and participate in the military option. Number 2, support the vigilant policing of the region's political borders to discourage the illicit export and import of cultural heritage artifacts. Number 3, encourage safe harbor protection of heritage artifacts in circulation outside their likely modern country of origin. Number 4, restore partage to promote the scientific excavation of ancient sites, to share the resulting finds with the global community, and to more broadly distribute the risk to their physical integrity through accident or intentional theft or destruction. And number 5, promote greater transnational cultural understanding of cultural identity. I've already raised the first 2 points, although I see I mentioned them in different order, but I've already raised the first 2 points. Now let me raise the final 3. Safe harbor. We are told that heritage artifacts in Iraq and Syria are being looted on the order of ISIS, then sold to middlemen, taken across Iraq and Syria's borders, and sold to international figures who then sell them on to private collectors or to disreputable museums. To the limited extent that such artifacts have surfaced outside Syria and Iraq, they have been returned to the political jurisdiction of those states from which they have been taken. Evidence of the recent destruction and illicit trading of cultural heritage artifacts in Iraq and Syria moved the U.S. House of Representatives to approve a bill which declared that, quote, "It shall be the policy of the United States to protect and preserve international cultural property at risk of looting, trafficking, and destruction due to political instability, armed conflict, or natural or other disasters, by in part giving the U.S. President the right to waive said import restrictions if the foreign owner or custodian of the specified cultural property has requested such property be temporarily located in the United States for protection purposes. B, that such property shall be returned to the foreign owner or custodian when requested by such foreign owner or custodian. And C, granting a waiver under this subsection will not contribute to illegal trafficking in cultural property or financing of criminal or terrorist activities." The specified cultural property could then be placed in the temporary custody of the United States government or in the temporary custody of a cultural educational institution within the United States for the purpose of protection, restoration, conservation, study, or exhibition without profit. This, I think, is an entirely reasonable and timely proposal. After due deliberation by the United Nations Chief Executive, or by the nation's Chief Executive, and at the request of the foreign owner of the heritage artifacts in question, the artifacts may be given safe harbor in a U.S. public institution for their safekeeping and the enjoyment and education of a broad public. As I write, this proposed bill has not become law, neither has a similar bill been introduced that would address such damage to cultural heritage in Iraq, only in Syria, and nor has the United Nations endorsed or adopted similar legislation. That the UN hasn't done this is particularly troubling, since a safe harbor proposal would be consistent with the UN's long-standing commitment to the protection of refugees, which the UN High Commissioner on Refugees acknowledges are often in a very vulnerable situation, and I would argue a similar vulnerable situation. They have no protection from their own state. Indeed, it is often their own government that is threatening to persecute them. We see that so dramatically playing out today. If other countries do not let them in and do not protect and help them once they are in, then they may be condemning them to an intolerable situation where their basic rights, security, and in some cases their lives are endangered. Further, the UNHCR pledges to protect refugees by ensuring that they will not be returned involuntarily to a country where they could face persecution. Longer term, the organization helps refugees find appropriate, durable solutions to their plight by repatriating them voluntarily to their homeland, integrating in countries of asylum, or resettling in third countries. If this is the right thing to do for refugees, why is it not also the right thing to do for threatened and looted movable cultural heritage? Didn't UNESCO General Director Bokova link acts of cultural cleansing, the destruction of cultural heritage, with acts of ethnic and cultural minorities? She said murder and destruction of culture are inherently linked. That's the safe harbor option, number 3. Number 4, partage. For many decades in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, archaeological finds were shared between the foreign excavating party and the local host country. Called partage, this practice provided the founding collections for new national museums in Baghdad, Cairo, and Kabul, for example, but also the collections for those foreign museums in Europe and North America. The distribution of these collections, here shown in Baghdad, Paris, London, and New York, not only provoked new interest in the artifacts they comprised and the histories of the cultures and areas in which they were made, it reduced the risk of damage to these objects by distributing them among multiple venues instead of concentrating them in a single venue. With the rise of nationalism over the course of the 20th century, the practice of partage was restricted and then almost entirely forbidden. I have argued the benefits of partage before, and at times my argument has been labeled imperialist, arguing that is for the transfer of cultural heritage from weaker political jurisdictions to stronger ones. That is not my argument. I am arguing instead for the sharing of heritage artifacts among all political jurisdictions, north, south, east, and west. Everywhere and anywhere, there are museums and universities prepared to take responsibility for the preservation and interpretation of humanity's heritage artifacts, and are willing in return to provide archaeological, museological, and conservation expertise, and gifts or long-term loans of heritage artifacts from their respective institutions to the originating museums in the source countries. Only then will Director Bakova's statement that the heritage artifacts in Iraq are a unique testimony of humanity, of the origins of our civilization, and of our inter-ethnic and inter-religious coexistence have real meaning. And only then, too, will it be clear that we all have a stake in the preservation not only of one nation's cultural heritage, but in that of the world's. 5. Promote greater transnational cultural understanding. At an international conference in December 2014, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the special envoys for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, and Iraq, Nikolai Maldonov, stressed that the region's heritage belongs to humanity as a whole, while the first speaker of the parliament called on nations to help safeguard the soul of Iraq, this is the Iraq parliament, the heritage of its successive and diverse cultures that stands for the region's tremendous contributions to humanity for over 6,000 years. Claims of national identity are often emotional, and UNESCO is caught in a difficult situation. On the one hand, it recognizes that, in its words, no culture is a hermetically sealed entity. All cultures are influenced by and in turn influence other cultures, nor is any culture changeless, invariant, or static. All cultures, it continues, all cultures are in a state of constant flux, driven by both internal and external forces. That's what it says on the one hand. On the other hand, it holds that cultural heritage is, in its words, one of the basic elements of civilization and national culture, and that the protection of cultural heritage can be effective only if organized both nationally and internationally among states working in close cooperation. UNESCO must resolve the inherent conflict between seeing culture as national, an integral building block of national identity, and global, belonging both to all nationals and to all humanity as part of humanity's moral and intellectual solidarity. National identity is as artificial as nations themselves. It is not natural. It is not rooted in the soil of a particular place or born of a common ethnic, linguistic, or religious origin. It is made and evolves and changes, often dramatically, over the course of history. In Benedict Anderson's famous formulation, nationalism imagines a community, a nation, precisely because none exists naturally. UNESCO must promote greater understanding of culture as transnational, as rooted in the truth that, as the sociologist Arjun Appadurai has argued, we need to think about ourselves beyond the nation. This is not to suggest that thought alone will carry us beyond the nation, or that the nation is largely a thought or an imagined thing. Rather, it is to suggest that the role of intellectual practices is to identify the current crisis of the nation, and in identifying it, to provide part of the apparatus of recognition for the post-national social forms. The situation in Iraq and Syria and the tenacity, complexity, and sophistication of ISIS requires a multilateral response from the international community. I have offered a 5-point proposal. It matches hard power with soft and short-term responses with long-term commitments. Ultimately, however, these steps will succeed only if political and economic stability can be returned to the region. A living link to our world's oldest civilizations in all their beauty and profundity is part of what makes us human, and affirming our humanity will be part of what, in the end, will allow us to defeat ISIS. Thank you.
So much for the incisive and insightful picture that you gave us of the very alarming situation in the Middle East, and also insight into the weakness of the international position, and also the very concrete proposals you offered us. So I thought it was a marvelous lecture. Thank you very much. I also would like to thank the two speakers of this morning. Roter, I don't know, did she make it to the aula in Roter? Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture this morning. It's a very fine lecture. And Taco Divic is also here in the aula. I would also like to thank him. Yeah, very much, because we had a very, very successful meeting in the museum this morning in the Groningen Museum, and that was all thanks to Andreas Bloem, the director of this museum. He is also part of the board, member of the board, not very long, but we welcomed him in our board. And his first gesture was hosting us at the Groningen Museum, and I think that raises the already lofty status of our Gerson lectures. It's very important to have this such a nice hosting service. So I think that also the next lectures Andreas will host us again. I hope so, and I thank him a lot for that. And also. So now we have come to the end of this Horst Gerson lecture, the 18th already, and I have to say some more down-to-earth things, that we are going now to have a drink, which is also a very important part of the Horst Gerson lecture. And so we're all going there now, and in that room the lecture will be for sale, because it's also part of the Horst Gerson lecture that the booklet itself is for sale already here on the spot. So we hope you will all buy it. You can survive. So I invite you to buy the lecture, and there are also the other booklets of our other lectures, previous lectures, because we are not that successful that they're all sold out. So you can still buy all the lectures. They're also the ones that are left. They are there for sale. So thank you very much for attending this 80th Horst Gerson lecture, and I invite you now all to go downstairs to have a drink.